Midnight Road. Chapter 1. August, 1986. On the evening of August 8th, when Billy Hudson sped into the sheriff's office in his cherry red Firebird, the prized Cadillac driven by Sheriff Andrew Lutz was narrowly avoided being side-swiped. Sheriff Lutz looked up from the old magazine he was mindlessly flipping through at the sound of tires screaming. In a single, smooth motion, he left his desk and crossed half of the station as he watched Billy's Pontiac's fender approach the driver's side door of his caddy. Looking at his scratched metal watch, Lutz wondered what the hell Billy was thinking. Lutz immediately assumed that the young man had been drinking because it was only a few minutes into the morning on a Saturday. What sort of drunk driver drives himself voluntarily into police custody? Billy Hudson stumbled out of the driver's side door, fell to his knees, and then stumbled back to his feet before the Firebird's wheels had come to a complete stop. "They are no more!" As he scrambled for equilibrium, Billy cried out of breath. "I believe all of the McGuires are dead." Lutz's mouth was already open to reprimand Billy for almost slamming the door of his Cadillac, but when Billy said those words, his jaws clicked shut. Lutz observed the situation in front of him. After Sheriff Bradley retired in 1975, he served as Richmond County Sheriff for more than 10 years, winning re-election twice. He spent most of his time on the highways in the 40,000-person county, which is 400 square miles in size, and was familiar with Billy Hudson and his gang of gearheads. Billy was a courteous child who always showed respect, but that wasn't always the case with the town's youth. The teenage males in the area were completely enamored with their automobiles, and they were frequently seen late at night drinking, drag racing, and having a wild time on one lonely country road or another. They weren't particularly horrible kids, there just wasn't much else to do in a place where maize and soybean fields predominated. Once they got too unruly and started blaring the speakers on their stereos loud enough to wake the long-suffering farmers in the neighborhood, Lutz or one of his deputies would have to go out and disperse the gathering, which would happen at least once a month. Lutz believed he understood what might have happened, his heart sinking. "Which of you struck them? What location was the accident?" "Sheriff, no one hit them." Billy firmly shook his head as he went for the walkie-talkie at his hip. "Tonight we weren't racing. The fact that Stu Lennox damaged his father's brand new Ford and—" "Get to the point, Billy." Lutz crowed. Saying sorry, sir. Billy had to take a deep breath before continuing since he had started speaking so quickly that his words were tripping over one another as they raced to come out. "Sheriff, there was no racing tonight. Molly Green, who resides in Oakville, and I were out. I drove her home after we had gone to the drive-in. I chose to travel the former Highway 99 on the way back because I wanted to. I enjoy how quiet it is outside at night. I wanted to disturb the peace by revving up the Pontiac away from the troopers on the state highway is more like it." Sheriff Lutz thought but didn't voice aloud. "Anyway, I was at the McGuire property, you know that large wooded area next to the farm? As I was traveling there, I believed I saw something cross the street. Similar to a large, shadowy bear. Frightened the hell out of me. I almost lost control of the vehicle." "There aren't any bears around here, son," the sheriff replied skeptically. "Sure it wasn't a deer?" "Sir, it wasn't any darn deer. It moved like a cat but had a bear's hump and slope. It was the first deer I had ever seen, but I only saw it for a split second. Its height was greater than my car's roof." "What nonsense was this?" Lutz ran a hand through his dark, thinning hair and looked down. It was then that he noticed the blood spattering Billy's dusty work boots and the hems of his jeans. Lutz took a hesitant step backward, moving his right hand ever so slightly toward the handgun holstered at his hip. He started inspecting the red Pontiac for dings and scratches, thinking the animal narrative was nothing more than a ruse. He cautiously circled back to the young man after searching for none, keeping a 10-foot distance. "All right, Billy. Before we start to run into trouble, you have approximately 12 seconds to start making sense. Why do you claim that the McGuires are no longer alive? Whose blood, kid, is that on your shoes? Sheriff, I was attempting to explain. As I was traveling down the old Highway 99, I noticed a large, menacing creature crossing the street. I'm not sure, sir, I'll be really honest. But it frightened me so much that I was on the verge of falling. Whatever it was had vanished into that area of forest close to the McGuire plot when I finally managed to stop the car on the shoulder and turn around. I came to the same conclusion as you, sir. Thought I was just seeing things late at night, Billy continued. But then I noticed some sort of liquid on the road in my headlights. Like oil, but when I took another look, it wasn't oil. Blood was seen. Is it possible this animal or whatever you saw could have been wounded? The sheriff asked. The moment I got out of the car and reached into the trunk for my Winchester gun, I said, that's the first thing I thought, too, Sheriff. I reasoned that I could at least end the suffering of the poor creature. But when I went closer to the blood on the road, when I got closer, Billy began to stutter, and it appeared as though all the strength in his legs had failed. His oil-stained blue pants slipped into the plush grass of the station's yard as he almost gracefully knelt down. Out with it, son. What did you see? Lutz asked. He was trying to be patient, but it was also imperative that they get to the scene of any crime as fast as possible. Billy inhaled deeply while trembling. An arm, please. A woman's arm was on the side of the road, barely past my headlamp. The elbow was severed. It still wore a wedding band. It was still wearing. At this point, Billy was trembling so violently that the sheriff feared he might be about to experience a seizure. He took a minute to glance around, perplexed by the sudden turn of events that had previously been his tranquil evening. He then crouched down close to the young man who was shaking on his haunches. Lutz habitually inhaled the air near Billy Hudson's head, almost hoping to catch a fragrance of booze like whiskey or gin. However, nothing was there. Lutz made a U-turn and headed back toward the sheriff's office. He shouted Clarkson for his senior deputy. Soon after, Henry Clarkson emerged from his cramped office and asked, "Sheriff?" Thank glad Clarkson was in charge tonight. Clarkson was a cool-headed cop who performed well under pressure. Henry Clarkson, the sole African-American on the police, had a commanding voice and a barrel chest that he could use to great effect on rowdy suspects. However, he also had a rational mind that ran over every scenario in his head before acting. Lutz prayed again, this time in relief that it wasn't Miller, his younger, jitterier deputy, who was sharing the station tonight. Is the cruiser full of gas? Good. Get the shotgun and the rifle, and also some flashlights. Highway 99 is our destination because something might have happened at Bud McGuire's house. The fact that Clarkson obeyed directions without questioning him endlessly was an added bonus. Following a brief nod, the deputy turned to carry out the request. Back outside, Lutz knelt down next to Billy Hudson, who was still hunched over on the grass with his head in his hands. Lutz yearned for a smoke because his tongue tasted bitter. Billy, it's all right. Son, good work. It's all right. Andrew Lutz repeated the mantra just breathe again and over, recalling how his father had used a similar approach to calm tense horses. The stiff strain along Billy Hudson's back softened, and after a few minutes his breathing started to calm. Billy inhaled slowly for a further 1 or 2 breaths before turning to face the sheriff. He added with deadly determination, after I found the arm, I proceeded into the home. Sir, I can't describe it. However, something terrible occurred there. If it's acceptable, I'd like to go right now and go home. Billy Hudson deserved to be told by Sheriff Lutz that he could return home, take a hot shower, and enjoy a stiff drink, but it was not to be. Billy, I'm sorry. please point out the precise location of where all of this occurred? We'll drive right by it in the dark as there are no lights there." Billy's face appeared to be fighting back tears for a moment, but his mouth clenched, and all he could muster was a helpless nod. While the two senior men went to check on the McGuires, Lutz contacted his junior deputy at home, waking him from a sound sleep and ordering him to haul his ass over and man the station. Then the three of them piled into the sheriff's cruiser and headed north to Highway 99. Chapter 2. The small town's mostly darkened structures gave way to the entirely darkened farmland that made up 90% of the area as the 20 miles from the sheriff's department to the McGuire farm passed in nearly utter silence. Every little village in the county was surrounded by endless acres of maize and soybeans, with a distance of up to 40 miles between each settlement. Since Lutz had lived his entire life in Richmond County, that region will always represent the horizon for him. Rarely did splotchy clumps of trees and thorny bushes break up this endless expanse of farmed land. Except for the Iowa River Nature Preserve, which covered approximately 30 miles of property on the western side of the roadway, the majority of these forests were no more than 20 acres broad. Bud McGuire's farm was located on the eastern side of the street. Andrew Lutz had always felt uneasy in those woods. It was a strange, quiet location with skeletal pines and briar bushes that didn't have any of the hidden paths or bubbling streams that he had loved as a child in the wooded areas. Hunters didn't use it either, even in an area overrun with ravenous deer. They had no desire to chew on the brittle pine bark that the trees gave. It was unclear what kind of nature the state administration intended to preserve. It was impossible to see anything beyond the orange beam of the cruiser's headlights with the smallest sliver of the waxing moon shining in the sky. Every man was deep in meditation. As they departed the station, Sheriff Lutz explained the situation in general terms to his deputy. At least one victim. Probably more. Reports of an enormous animal. A mountain lion, perhaps. The question, a mountain lion, sir? When Andrew told Officer Clarkson, he was completely perplexed and questioned. "Sheriff, have you checked around? Do you notice any mountains?" "If we're going to Bud McGuire's house, sir, you and I both know what we're going to find there." "Yes," Lutz thought as he pulled onto the pitted asphalt of Highway 99. "I know exactly what we're likely to find." His hands were begging for a smoke, but he resisted the desire. He attempted to ignore the sinking feeling of dread in his gut as his thoughts turned to Bud McGuire. When Andrew Lutz first met Buddy McGuire, he was in his mid-20s. He had observed a small boy sitting in the dirt next to a dog in an abandoned lot while on patrol one afternoon, traveling through the town's peaceful streets. On its side, the dog was sleeping. Lutz parked and went over to the couple, worried that a cherished pet had been hit by a car. The child observed the brindle mutt convulse in the dust while shallowly panting. It had large, mournful eyes. Buddy, who at the time could not have been older than 8 or 9 years old, watched the dying animal without displaying any emotion. "Is this your dog, son?" Lutz had asked kindly. Buddy remained silent. Buddy ignored Lutz and continued to observe the dog as its breathing slowed, even though most kids were always courteous to police officers, at least in those days. "Do you know what happened to this animal?" Lutz tried again. Yet nothing. At the boy's feet, though, Lutz had later seen a sheet of butcher paper balled up. He could also make out pieces of ground flesh when he looked closer. In his mind, a picture of what had happened was starting to take shape. "Did you give poison bait to this dog, boy?" Lutz demanded, raising his voice for the first time. When Lutz yelled, the boy finally turned to look Lutz in the eyes. The officer took a step back in shock at the child's expressionless face. Being addressed by a stranger, a policeman at that, there was neither dread nor any inclination of intimidation. Buddy McGuire's eyes didn't reflect anything back. Lutz, who was shaken, had told then-Sheriff Bradley about the event. Bradley made the observation that the animal had been a stray, not a beloved pet, by hooking his thumbs into the drooping waistband of his pants. Although it was a horrific death, local farmers would frequently shoot or poison stray animals that trespassed into their land. On rare occasions, the mutts would murder chicks and ducks or even start posing a threat to the farmers' young children as they played outside. The youngster had presumably learned it from seeing his own father, who was a necessary evil. Lutz had gone back to the abandoned lot later that evening and buried the animal himself. Buddy McGuire established himself as one of those boys who were just incredibly good at hurting others over the course of the following 10 years. When Buddy was in the 6th grade, a senior had made fun of him for having untidy, messy hair. Buddy had approached the bigger boy in full front of the classmates and teachers, grabbed his wrist, and twisted until bones crunched. Bud McGuire had been expelled in his 10th grade, and 2 years later, he was just in time to be drawn into the Vietnam War. Nobody is quite sure what he got up to over there, but in 1975, when he returned to the village, it seemed as though a rage-filled blanket had been draped over Bud's shoulders. While he was away fighting illness, his father passed away, and Bud inherited the family's roughly 100 acres. This modest farm had been in the family for 3 generations, just providing enough to keep food in their stomachs and clothing on their backs. Bud McGuire was let down by the dirt, that heavy, dark soil of the Midwest. Every crop he planted, corn, beans, wheat, seemed to wither and perish at his hands. His fellow farmers were successful, the fertile soil of the region producing robust, green rows of maize virtually overnight. Despite everything, Bud still managed to find a wife. A pallid slip of a girl was spotted hanging laundry on the McGuire farm's front yard in the fall of 1977, just 15 months after Bud returned from the war. She had wide, blue eyes that were always fixed on the ground, and long, mousy brown hair. Nobody knew who she was or where she came from. The community's women, who were all preoccupied with genealogy, would have been furious about this, but no information about the girl could be discovered. She had only recently been there, quietly tending to hens or scrubbing rugs. She never visited the town, never spoke to anybody. About a year following the arrival of this enigmatic woman, Andrew Lutz had his second professional contact with Bud McGuire. The neighborhood residents had thrown up their hands in exasperation because despite all of their thoughtful actions and housewarming casseroles, the door had remained closed. The McGuire family had never been observed attending any of the numerous churches in the neighborhood, and the young woman had never shown up at the grocery store where the wives could attack her. The initial confusion had given way to righteous indignation. Who did they think they were, holed up all high and mighty on their plot of land? Did the McGuires think they were too good to associate with their peers? However, the weeks passed and the young woman was nowhere to be found in the town. When winter came, the few persons who drove on the old county road could no longer see her outside. The townspeople's initial outrage started to turn into worry. Was she all right? Buddy had a notoriously bad temper, even before his time spent in the Vietnam War jungles. Finally, the wives badgered their husbands in the spring of 1978 until the men had called the local police. To calm the anxieties of their anxious neighbors, the police then called the sheriff's department and requested that someone go check on the girl. Lutz, who was the junior deputy on duty at the time, left for the McGuire property by traveling along Highway 99. The terrain in March was a quagmire of mud that sucked at Lutz's boots as he got out of the police car, only 3 miles from the Mississippi River floodplains. The home was a classic farmhouse with 2 floors and sweeping gables that rose to form an attic with a 3rd story. The entry was reached via a wide, wraparound porch supported by substantial wooden beams. Lutz had taken a cautious check around before ascending the steps to the porch. He had twice knocked. No response. Lutz walked away from the home and instead went around the back, where sure enough, a small young woman was dividing a fresh spring herbs into a variety of bowls. This was something that had been anticipated. Lutz placed his hands in front of him to demonstrate that he meant no harm when she reacted like a startled cat upon seeing him. "Greetings, ma'am. I'm Deputy Lutz, and I work for the Sheriff's office. Could I have your name?" He approached the girl slowly while speaking in a quiet, kind manner. The girl's eyes had been sky blue as they looked into his with an unreadable expression. "April." Little more than a breath out, the word had been barely audible, and Lutz was about to ask her to repeat herself when the girl's eyes narrowed and widened in horror at something beyond his shoulder. Lutz turned to look at Bud McGuire, who was standing a short distance behind them. Just like when he had looked at the dead dog, his black eyes had been soulless and soulless. A double-barreled shotgun with a long, slender muzzle was leaning casually on his shoulder and directed at the sky. Thankfully, Lutz had avoided the impulse to jump at the sight of the big man. "Bud, good morning," he said. Lutz had moved his hand to the revolver held at his hip with slow, methodical motions, and thumbed open the clasp. As he was supposed to, Bud had taken note. Lutz realized this was the first time he had heard Bud speak as his mouth twisted in a scowl, and he replied, "You're not welcome here," in a flat, toneless voice. Lutz had replied in a firm voice, "I'll be leaving shortly. People have been inquiring as to how you two have survived up here by yourselves for the entire winter. I decided to stop by and make sure everything was well." "Fine. You've observed." With those words, Bud covered the small distance separating him and his new wife. Lutz had been waiting for him to strike her so the deputy could take him into the station, but instead, Bud simply stood close to the girl with a look of utter rage on his face. Throughout this interaction, April McGuire had been completely silent. She now jumped up from her work table as if she had been scalded. When she knelt, Lutz observed something he hadn't before. A sizable wicker box covered in woolen blankets stood under the table. A little baby, wrapped in a blanket, was curled up and slept. Without saying anything further, the girl grabbed the basket and ran into the home. The shotgun was still perched on Bud's shoulder when he turned. "This is my land. There hasn't been a crime committed. You have." Since that day about 8 years ago, he hadn't visited the McGuire property again. Only a few times in those 8 years had the McGuire family been spotted either returning or departing along Highway 99 in Bud's beat-up Dodge Ram. They eventually welcomed a daughter into their family. Both the neighborhood Christian school and the neighborhood public school never saw either youngster. Lutz often took a leisurely drive down the county road in the hopes of spotting April McGuire or her kids playing in the yard. Lutz was compelled to continue driving because the house had been silent and shuttered. Most members of the neighborhood had long since stopped talking negatively about the McGuires throughout the years. Everyone felt sorry for the lonely young mother, her children, and Bud's rage. However, this group was also conservative and valued their right to privacy. Everyone simply shrugged their heads and continued living their lives as long as there didn't seem to be an issue at the McGuire farm, despite the fact that they were all aware of what was likely to happen in the end. Sheriff Andrew Lutz was kicking himself for not doing more and for not making up a ludicrous excuse to go check on April and her kids as he came closer to the McGuire homestead. He only hoped he wasn't too late. But it didn't look as though that were the case. Sir?" Andrew Lutz was abruptly awakened by Billy Hudson's voice from his remorse and sorrow. He was about to miss the blind turn in the road leading up to Bud's property because he was so preoccupied with his spooky thoughts. Instead, the giant pine tree was the target of the hefty police car.
Chapter 3. Lutz twisted the steering wheel violently, and the ponderous car screeched its resistance to such treatment, fishtailing wildly across the road in long, snaking arcs before he was able to get control. Heart hammering from the near miss, the sheriff pointed the car at the shallow gravel shoulder and pulled over. His hands were clutching the steering wheel in a white-knuckle grip, and it took a moment of effort to release them. He killed the engine, and for a long moment the only sound was the quiet ticking of the engine as it cooled. Ahead of this curve, the trees would open on side at the beginning of the Maguire farm. "Sorry about that, guys," he finally managed to say. Officer Clarkson was looking at him with pure astonishment, as if he had just seen a mountain lion in the farmlands of Iowa. In the rearview mirror, Billy met his gaze with a dark look as the two officers unclipped their seatbelts and stepped out into the humid summer night. Immediately, something felt off, and the flesh on Lutz's arms crawled. He motioned for Clarkson to join him, and released Billy from his cage in the back seat. Crossing to the trunk, Lutz pulled out the rifle and handed it to Deputy Clarkson. He grabbed the shotgun and two high-beam flashlights before closing the trunk. With a nod of understanding, he passed the shotgun and one of the flashlights to Billy Hudson. All of the boys and most of the girls in this region learned to shoot before they were 10 years old. Knowledge of firearms and firearms safety was deeply ingrained in a community where almost everyone's deep freezers were stocked full of fresh venison every autumn. Lutz felt no hesitation about handing the shotgun over to the younger man. The kid had sense, even if he was overly fond of drag racing. His driver's side door was still open. Lutz reached in to turn off the headlights and then thought twice. The dim light was all they had beside the heavy maglite he now carried opposite his service pistol. He left the cruiser's lights running, closed the door to the car with a heavy thud, and the three of them turned to survey their surroundings. That odd feeling was still creeping up the back of Lutz's neck, but it was Billy who was able to give voice to his unease. "All the bugs are quiet," the young man whispered. Lutz listened carefully and realized he was right. This was high summer, the air was thick and humid, and it should have been filled with the chirps of insects. The nightly concerto of katydids, cicadas, and crickets was usually enough to drive a man half mad, but here there wasn't so much as the buzz of a mosquito. The only sound was the quiet tapping of the men's boots as they began walking north towards Bud Maguire's home. The light from the headlights didn't fail to penetrate the gloom ahead, and Lutz clicked on the high-powered maglite. Next to him, Billy shouldered the shotgun, his smaller flashlight pressed with one hand under the barrel. Deputy Clarkson was at the ready with the long Winchester rifle at his shoulder. Normally used when a deputy needed to put down a wounded animal on the side of the highway, Lutz was immensely grateful just now for its solidly reliable presence. Lutz swept the flashlight in slow, careful strokes from one edge of the road to another. "Where did you say you saw this now, son?" he asked Billy. A little farther ahead, I think." Billy's voice came from his right. "Maybe another 300 feet or so." Lutz continued methodically sweeping his flashlight from side to side. At the edge of the beam he could make out the burned rubber made by tires suddenly skidding across the road. The tracks continued up the road, fading away into the darkness. The men were now far enough away from the relative safety of the car that its dim headlights could no longer assist in penetrating the gloom ahead. The beams from the two flashlights seemed to grow smaller and fainter as they walked in loose formation up the road. Abruptly, the burnt rubber skids made by Billy's tires came to an end about 6 feet in front of them. The three men all stopped together, staring dumbfoundedly ahead. In the beam of Billy's flashlight, on the edge of the road as it faded into scrub grass, was the arm of a human female. It had been torn crudely at the elbow, and bloody strings of meat hung from one end. The other end was wearing a thin gold wedding band around the ring finger. The nails were chipped and embedded with dirt. All the blood in his body seemed rushed to his head, and Lutz could feel his heartbeat pounding sickeningly in his temples. Deputy Clarkson gave a violent heave and turned to vomit quietly into the ditch on the other side of the highway. Lutz squatted down on his haunches near the severed arm, and reached for the ballpoint pen he kept in his shirt pocket. Turning his head to take one more breath of unfouled air, he used the pen to lift one of the strips of flesh away from the wound. It had been almost shredded, and for one horrifying instant the image of Lutz's late wife's venison jerky came to his mind. Sour bile rose in his throat, and he fought against the urge to puke. What animal could do this to a person? What animal would bother? To his knowledge, there had never been reports of bear in this area, and any wolves had been killed off generations ago. Coyotes would take a chicken or a duck once in a while, but Lutz couldn't recall a single instance of them going after a small child, let alone a grown woman. Besides, these weren't the teeth or claw marks of a coyote. Whatever had done this had had much longer teeth. A sudden snap from the forest on his left. Lutz's blood turned to ice in his veins. Clarkson heard it too. His rifle was back at his shoulder in an instant, and he took a hesitant step towards the looming blackness. Next to him, Billy Hudson was utterly rigid, his fingers deathly white around the grip of the shotgun. Another snap in the darkness. Had that one been closer? He quickly swung the beam of the flashlight away from the grisly scene on the road, in the direction of the woods. It illuminated skeletal pine trees and waist-high thorn bushes. The light shone eerily on the narrow trunks of the pines. With their ladders of broken branches, the trees became rows of menacing spears waiting to impale unwary travelers. The unnatural silence of the woods was oppressive. Lutz peered into the darkness, willing the shadows to separate into shapes. He focused on the edges of the light, where it faded into a thick and impenetrable blackness. He thought he could see shapes in the dark, looming patches of shadow that were somehow blacker than the night. A hulking figure dancing just out of his field of vision. But nothing came charging at them from out of the woods, and after a long moment Lutz relaxed his posture. Telling himself unconvincingly that it had been a deer, Lutz turned back to Billy. They now had evidence of a death, but not necessarily evidence of a crime. There was still work to be done before they could all go back home. "Did you say there were more bodies?" he asked. Billy hesitated for a long moment and then replied, "Yes. Maybe. I don't know. Just come see for yourselves." Clarkson looked bewildered by the answer, but rolled his eyes and shrugged. "Let's get this done, Sheriff. This place gives me the fucking creeps." Hearing his deputy admit his apprehension somehow served to boost Lutz's own confidence. The forest was now at his back, and he felt watchful eyes on them, but he shook off his nerves. Nodding affirmation at Billy, he confirmed, "Let's get this the fuck over with and go home." Leaving the lone, pitiful arm on the side of the highway, the men now began skirting the edge of the cornfield that bordered Bud McGuire's home. The corn, which should have towered over them at a full height of 16 feet, was sickly-looking and scrawny. This actually offered Lutz some comfort, The weakened stalks of the malnourished crops made it easier for the beam of his maglite to pierce the fields. Looming ahead, set back nearly a quarter-mile from the edge of the highway, was the Maguire house. At first, it looked much the same as when Lutz had paid his visit 8 years previously, but the disrepair of the home became increasingly apparent as they turned onto the loose gravel driveway. At the start of the path was a rusty tin mailbox, leaning precariously on its weathered wooden post. The Maguires had obviously failed to keep up with their correspondence. He wondered idly how Bud took care of things like electricity and plumbing if bills never came to their house. The main house must have been truly lovely in some bygone age. Its frame was a clean and crisp colonial, with gabled windows and a large wraparound porch. But the clean lines were obscured by a sagging roof and missing shutters. The porch was also drooping, with a dilapidated wicker couch sitting neglected to one corner. What must once have been cheerful white paint and blue trimming was now grey and peeling in great strips from the wood. The whole house had an air of exhaustion, like a once proud old horse that no longer had the energy to hold its head up in the traces. The front door was hanging open by one twisted hinge. As the men approached, Lutz held up one hand curled into a fist as a signal to hold position. His earlier jitters had cleared away, replaced by the curiously detached feeling he always felt when was approaching a crime scene that's sure to be unpleasant. Normally it was a high school kid who partied too hard and wrapped his car around a tree. Or a trucker who came home drunk and decided to put his wife in the morgue. After 30 years in the sheriff's department, Lutz was no stranger to the violence inherent in men. It wasn't a man that tore off that child's arm, though. As if to confirm this chilling thought, Lutz shone his flashlight on the broken door of the house. Scratched deep into the wood, deep enough that the door was nearly splintered into pieces, were 4 parallel gouges running from the top of the door frame to the bottom corner in one long, unbroken arc. The aluminium doorknob was twisted out of shape and hung uselessly to one side. Beyond the door lay only more blackness. Chapter 4. Deputy Clarkson had been a wonderfully good sport up until this point, but when presented with the prospect of crossing the threshold of this house, he balked. He released his death grip on his rifle, lowering it to his side and exclaiming, "No offense, Sheriff, but fuck this. I'm not going in there. Let's go back to the car and call." "Call who, Henry?" Lutz said flatly. "The state troopers can't do anything except write tickets to out-of-towners. The town police call us when there is a violent death. So who exactly should we call? Animal control?" Clarkson glowered back at him. "Then let's go back to the car and come back in the goddamn daylight," he hissed between clenched teeth. Personally, Lutz felt that Clarkson was speaking the most sense that anyone had all night. But as much as he privately agreed with his deputy's plan to retreat far away from the Maguire house, they were there and there was a job to do. "Come on now, Henry. Billy's been inside. Can't let the kids show us up now, can we?" Lutz said with a forced lightheartedness that rang false in his ears. He sighed, ran one hand along his forehead and through his salt and pepper hair, and tried again. "Yeah, this sucks. Doesn't change facts. We have to find out what, if anything, occurred here tonight. So let's just sack up and get it done, yeah." It wasn't much of a pep talk, but it seemed to do the trick. Billy gave a heavy shrug, scuffing his boots against the brown grass bordering the Maguires' front porch. Clarkson closed his eyes for a moment as if offering up a silent prayer, then re-shouldered his firearm and nodded at Lutz. "I'm taking a long weekend," he stated matter-of-factly. "Gonna take my wife up to Iowa City. Gonna go to Red Lobster. It's Crab Fest." He continued muttering to himself about his upcoming weekend, but brushed past Lutz and climbed the creaking steps onto the porch. "You can have the whole week off," Lutz mentally promised his deputy. Then he pulled his revolver out of its holster, thumbed the safety off, and followed the two men past the entrance and into Bud McGuire's home. A profound silence settled around the men as they crossed the threshold of the McGuire house. The footsteps made by the officer's heavy boots were muffled by the layer of dust that lay upon the floor. In the beam of the flashlight, the wallpaper in the foyer may have been a sunny striped yellow at some point, but had been warped with water damage and was now the color of old urine. Ahead of the men was a long corridor with a doorway on either side. On one side, Lutz could see the ubiquitous farmhouse mudroom, complete with rows of rubber Wellington boots and heavy winter parkas. The wellies were dull and cracked with disuse, and the coats were moth-eaten and smelled of damp. A closed door led deeper into the house, probably into the kitchen. On the left side of the corridor was a room Lutz's wife would have referred to as a parlor when she was alive, with delicate furniture and assorted porcelain figurines. Here was the first evidence of human activity. The dainty tables were smashed to bits, and the rose-patterned love seat was at a defined angle to a moth-eaten rug, as if someone had forcibly shifted the couch by standing with sudden force. A broken water jug lay in pieces on the floor. Oddly enough, even this violent scene was gentled by a thick layer of dust. So far, the only sign that a living person had been in the house were the tracks he could see in the corridor that had clearly been made by Billy's heavy work boots. Where were the McGuires? Lutz moved on a constant pivot, shining his high-powered flashlight into every corner and crevice. His senses felt electrified as he strained each one of his senses to determine whether or not a threat still lurked in this house. According to his eyes and ears, this was just a normal house, though terribly neglected. "Billy," he whispered under his breath. "Why the fuck did you even come in here?" Billy responded equally quietly, "Like I said, sir, I thought maybe someone was in trouble. But when I got here it was like I just had to keep going. I had to see for myself." Lutz understood. He could feel it too. The panicky urge to head back for the car was drowned out by grim determination. He needed to find out what the hell had happened here. Past the open doorways to the mudroom and the parlor was a flight of stairs that went from the first floor all the way to the attic in a long switchback. The stairs, like everything else in the McGuire house, seemed to be standing upright by sheer force of will alone. Running along the right edge of the staircase, in a long unbroken line from top to bottom, was a wide swath of dried blood. The first thought that ran through Sheriff Lutz's mind in that moment was that he wished he lived in a larger city, with more resources. If they were farther north, near Des Moines or Cedar Rapids, the three men standing in the McGuire house could be surrounded by backup within an hour. A small fleet of detectives, forensic experts, photographers, evidence baggers, and rubberneckers could gather at the homestead. The living darkness of the August summer night would be beaten back by high-powered flashbulbs and battery-powered spotlights. Under their harsh glare, and soothed by the shocked talk of the gathered officials, whatever horrors had visited the McGuire family would be revealed as just another crime scene, still tragic but acceptable to the mind. A sane sequence of events. Unfortunately, his little pocket of eastern Iowa was small and underpopulated. The mechanics needed to properly investigate a potential crime were simply not in place. As much as Lutz dreaded the idea, it would have to be him that ventured up those stairs, and it would have to be now. He would have to venture up there, and so would Clarkson, as department regulations forbade an officer from entering a potential crime scene alone. Plus, he wanted Clarkson's steady presence beside him with the Winchester. That didn't mean they all had to go. Billy, Lutz said to the young man without turning, if you don't want to go up there a second time, now is your chance. Go wait for us on the porch. Stand guard. With all due respect, sir, there is no way I am staying down here by myself. Billy squared his shoulders and gave Lutz a defiant look. Your choice, kid. Lutz gave him a nod and turned back to the problem of the staircase. They would have to make sure they didn't contaminate the crime scene with their boots. The blood was thick all the down the stairs, where it abruptly stopped on the second to last riser. Here, a slightly thicker pool of blood still shone with faint wetness under his flashlight. Whatever had happened here, had happened recently. Slow and steady does it, now. Don't step in it. Squeezing his lanky frame to the far edge of the staircase, Lutz placed a heavy boot on the first riser. A puff-up dust arose, and the stair gave an wheezing groan, but it did not buckle under his weight. Lutz began slowly advancing his way up the stairs, pressing firmly on each stair first to test its stability. The staircase creaked and moaned but continued to hold firm, and he motioned for Clarkson to follow. Lutz could hear his usually taciturn deputy muttering various prayers and swear words under his breath. The swath of blood continued up the stairs in an unbroken streak. Now it veered off to the right and disappeared into the darkness of a long corridor. The overwhelming odor was of dirt and mold, but the coppery smell of fresh blood was also thick in the air. A few framed photos hung at uneven intervals, their subjects almost completely obscured with dust. The dust on the floor was disturbed now, but there were no distinct tracks. It had been swept almost clean away in some places. Resigned now to seeing this through, Lutz felt his earlier fear retreat to the back of his mind. The adrenaline pumping through his system was working for him now, sharpening his focus and steadying his pulse. The corridor opened twice to the right, and Lutz circled warily around the open entrance to the first room. A cursory glance revealed a dingy bathroom. Or perhaps it had once been a bathroom. Now it was a heap of stained and cracked porcelain, with a rusted-out pipe hanging loosely where a sink may have been. Torn linoleum covered parts of the floor, but most of it was the same weathered floorboards as the rest of the upstairs. The air was heavy with the smells of stale grime and mildew. The path of blood, which had become thicker as they advanced along the corridor, continued down the hallway to the second room. Lutz signaled to Billy to cover the entrance of the bathroom, then he and Clarkson advanced, firearms cocked and ready. Lutz still carried the maglite, held to the top of his service pistol, so he was the first to cautiously peer around the corner of the room at the end of the hall. When Lutz first shone his flashlight into the darkened room, he actually breathed a sigh of relief. He had expected to find the strewn and dismembered bodies of April Maguire and her children in pieces about the floor. Instead, the room appeared entirely empty on first glance. There were no severed limbs clad in footy pajamas. There was also no furniture, curtains, rugs, or anything else to indicate that the space had ever been occupied by inhabitants other than mice. The bare wooden floor was littered with their droppings, but not much else. He began sweeping his flashlight from floor to ceiling. The walls had been painted a deep scarlet that looked almost wet by the light of the For a span of time that felt like an eternity but was in reality probably more like 30 seconds, Lutz stood stock still in the entrance to that room, his head cocked to one side like a man trying to figure out a really good riddle. One eyebrow was raised, and his mouth hung open in bewilderment. The room had been drenched in great splashes of blood that reached all the way to the ceiling in some places. It was swirled in sporadic circles across the floor, and spattered against all four walls. The closest thing Lutz could compare it to. Behind him, Lutz could hear Clarkson's sharp intake of breath as he also took in the scene before them. Then it was as if all the air went out of his lungs, and Sheriff Lutz suddenly deflated. He felt his knees give way, and had to lean one hand against the outside wall of the hallway for support as his vision blurred and his head spun. He still held the flashlight in one hand and it was pointed into the room, shining onto the dripping walls. He felt more than saw Clarkson stumble backwards into the wall behind him. Billy stood at the doorway to the demolished bathroom, studying the mud on his boots. Lutz realized that the younger man had already seen all of this. "Billy, did you see any bodies when you were here earlier?" Billy met the sheriff's eyes directly. "When I saw the blood on the stairs, I figured maybe someone was still alive up here. But when I got up here there was nothing. The batteries in my flashlight were starting to die, and then I saw that room." He gestured towards the room with the bloody walls. "I got the hell out of here quick as I could. I didn't check any of the other rooms." "So then where the fuck are the bodies?" "It looks like Bud McGuire and his family in a salad spinner. There's blood on the goddamned ceiling." Clarkson queried, stepping closer to the open door of the empty room and glancing inside once more. "Yeah, but that's the problem. It's blood. Just blood. No bones. No organs." Lutz's mind was still spinning as it frantically tried to bring a sense of logic into what it had just witnessed. There should be pieces of the McGuires everywhere. But so far, the only evidence of an actual crime is that arm out on the road. He turned to face the other two men, continuing to speak under his breath. Clarkson faced him, his normally placid face a mask of tension and fear. "Yeah, how did that arm even get out there? Why does it look like no one has lived here in 5 years? Where the hell are the McGuires?" This last sentence he said in a whispered shout. "Are they in the barn? The basement? Did Bud chop them up and carry them into the woods? Was it even Bud? What the hell were those claw marks on the door, Sheriff?" Clarkson continued his questioning in a voice that did not conceal his rising terror. Lutz gripped his deputy tightly by the shoulders, his own fear gone in the face of his officer's increasingly panic. "Of course it was Bud, Henry. We'll find him. Don't worry." This idea, as nightmarish as it was, offered a kind of morbid comfort. Bud McGuire might be a deranged madman who had just killed his entire family, but he was a man. A man bled when you shot him. This whole time Billy Hudson had been silent, his eyes fixed on the open doorway to the dingy bathroom. Now Billy cleared his throat, and almost sheepishly said, "Sheriff, you might want to see this." Had there ever been less welcome words in human history? Lutz pinched his nose between two fingers and reluctantly asked, "What is it?" Billy just gestured with the head of the shotgun, and in the bright glow from his maglite Lutz could see a thin line of blood slowly making its way from behind the open bathroom door. Immediately his heart, which had just begun to resume its regularly scheduled beat, started jackhammering wildly in his chest. Somehow, in that moment, Lutz knew. Whatever they had come here to find was on the other side of that door. On their first walk through of the corridor, all three men had been preoccupied by the path of blood that led to the room at the end of the hall. Now, upon closer inspection, Lutz realized that there was the faintest glimmer of light coming from the darkened bathroom. His mouth was dry as a bone, and Lutz swallowed hard, and then, pistol still at the ready, he eased around the doorway of the bathroom and put his back against the nearest wall. He checked the corner and, finding it empty, proceeded to circle slowly around the room. Clarkson covered him from behind, while Billy stood guard once more outside the room. The light was coming from two flickering candles, the tall glass ones of the sort his grandmother used to burn on Sundays. The flames were sputtering their last breaths, and two more candles had already drowned in their own wax. How long do those candles burn? Lutz made a mental note to check and kept his eyes on a swivel, trying to observe as much as possible about the scene. The candles had been arranged next to a chipped green bathtub. They formed a small circle, in the middle of which was a blackened circle, as someone had foolishly decided to build a fire in the middle of the floor. On the edge of the bathtub was a draped of faded calico dress. Lutz approached the garment, which had been carefully arranged so as not to wrinkle against the sides of the tub. The tub itself was empty. Lutz suddenly froze as he heard Clarkson swore a low oath behind him. Filled with sudden dread, he pivoted instinctively on his heel and prepared to fire. For the first time that night, Andrew Lutz screamed at the top of his lungs. Slumped in one corner of the trashed bathroom, in a slowly spreading pool of blood, was what remained of Bud McGuire.
The last chapter of The Midnight Road. Lutz couldn't tear his eyes away from the gruesome sight. Bud McGuire's face was frozen in a silent shriek, wide eyes fixed unblinking at the ceiling. His chest had been torn open crudely. The glinting white of ribs poked through the carnage. Bud's legs were bent at an impossible angle to his torso. He had been torn almost in two at the groin. The first scream that passed Sheriff Lutz's lips was quickly followed by a second. He fell backwards to the ground and landed hard on his rear, using the heels of his feet to push himself away from the mutilated corpse. His back pressed against the rusted green bathtub, and he idly noticed that the calico dress laying across the edge had a faint pattern of purple violets. Then Clarkson's strong brown hands were wrapped around his own, and his deputy hauled Lutz to his feet. They exited the broken bathroom and its grisly contents and went into the corridor, where Billy Hudson was already halfway down the stairs leading to the first floor. The ancient staircase creaked threatening beneath their boots as the two officers followed the younger man downstairs, desperate to get as far away from Bud McGuire's mutilated corpse as possible. Lutz burst out still-open front door and stumbled down the porch steps. The humid summer air was like a soothing balm against his skin. His lungs heaved with the effort to draw in fresh breath and he sank to his knees, digging his fists into the hard gravel of the walkway. He could hear the footsteps of Deputy Clarkson and Billy sounding down the stairs and out onto the front lawn. They remained mercifully silent as Lutz fought against the waves of heat and chills that kept alternating their way through his veins. Distantly, as if observing someone else from far above, Lutz understood that he was having a panic attack. With shaking arms he shifted his weight until he was sitting on the lawn bordering the front path. Dry grass crackled as he brought his knees up to his forehead and sat there, breathing in the night air. Somewhere nearby a cricket chirped, breaking the stillness. Crickets were still chirping. Somehow, this was an encouraging thought. Lutz raised his head and looked for a moment at the night sky. The sun was still hours away from rising and the sky was pitch black, except for the thousands of glittering stars. Lutz took a deep breath and held it for a long moment before slowly exhaling. He repeated this steady breathing twice more then wearily got to his feet, wincing as both his knees cracked in protest. He brushed dry grass off the pants of his uniform and looked at his companions, both of whom had remained silently nearby this entire time. Nodding once in silent gratitude, Lutz resumed his authority as sheriff. None of them would speak a word of his temporary breakdown, but they could all feel a sudden shift in the atmosphere, as if a sudden bond of kinship had just been forged. Lutz knew that the three of them would forever be bound by the events of this night. Officer Clarkson looked to his senior officer. "Do you want to check the rest of the property? Look for the rest of the family?" Lutz began shaking his head almost immediately. "No, we found what we were looking for. This is officially a crime scene. It's also a 40-acre farm with 2 barns and at least 10 outbuildings. We need more men. You want to call in Miller and Sanchez?" Clarkson asked. Lutz nodded, but then shook his head. "Yeah, we'll call them in when we get back to the station. No radio signal out here worth a damn anyway. Besides, I think we also need to get on the phone with the mayor's office. We're going to need the forensics people in Iowa City or Davenport or wherever the hell." At this, Sheriff Lutz turned and began walking back the way they had come. He glanced back once more at the darkened windows of the McGuire farmhouse, which now seemed like looming eyes in the receding light from their flashlights. His boots crunched under the rough gravel of the long driveway as the 3 men headed back towards the car. The yellow, sickly-looking corn blocked their view on either side, looming far taller than a man even in this unhealthy state. Lutz was struck again by the eerie silence of the place. The humid summer air was heavy and still, not a breath of wind rustled through the stalks. The near-complete absence of sound made him antsy and uncomfortable. The sooner they were back to the car the better. Billy must have felt the same way. He trotted up alongside Lutz, his rifle loosely grasped in one hand now that they were out of the farmhouse. In a low voice he said, "What will happen now, Sheriff?" Lutz shrugged. "First, we're going to go back to the station. I have a bottle of Lagavulin 16 in a locked box in my office. Sheriff Bradley gave me that bottle the day I took office. Now, he told me this whiskey was peaty enough and smoky enough to burn away the worst night of your life, told me there would someday come the night when I would need it. It sat in its wooden box every night until I really started to think that day would never come. But come it did, and tonight I'm going to open that bottle and drink deep. And you'll drink with me, if you like." Heartened by this prospect, the men picked up the pace and within a few minutes they emerged from the McGuire's driveway back onto the smooth paved surface of Highway 99. Like an angel in the darkness, Lutz could see the police cruiser sitting on the edge of the road about 300 yards down. He breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that some secret part of him had expected the black and white Chevy to be gone, leaving them stranded at the McGuire farm. Lutz's palms were sweating, and he wiped them furtively on the thighs of his trousers. He checked his watch, then checked it again in disbelief. They had barely been gone 40 minutes. When they reached the car, Lutz fumbled in his pocket for his keys, then unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, and he wondered briefly if he was fit to drive. "Can't exactly ask Clarkson or Billy to chauffeur me home," he thought resignedly. Lutz unlocked the passenger and back doors, and his companions slid silently into their seats. Clarkson was still holding the buck rifle, and the shotgun was in Billy's lap, the mounted flashlight still beaming a bright circle on the car's upholstery. As one, the men fastened their seatbelts. The familiar, everyday click of the metal sliding into place struck him as utterly absurd after the night's events. Lutz slid the key to the Chevy into the ignition. He had a horrible, crawling feeling in the bottom of his stomach that when he turned the key, the engine would simply refuse to start. This was ridiculous since the cruiser was barely 3 years old and had never done anything but purr like a kitten. But tonight, right now, the car wouldn't start. Because it couldn't be this easy to just drive away. The key turned, and the motor roared to life, just as it always did. The front headlights came on, casting 2 wide beams of light into the darkness around them. Reflecting back, impossibly high against the skeletal pines of the forest, were a pair of glowing red eyes. Clarkson screamed first, throwing his hands over his face and crying out in terror. Lutz couldn't scream, his voice seemed to have completely locked itself away. His mouth gaped open in horror, but the only sound that came out was a strangled choke. Billy was scrambling to get out of the police cruiser, but since he was in the back the doors only opened from the outside. He tried rolling down the window, and when that failed he began to panic and bashed at the glass with his fist again and again, but this was equally ineffective. Billy raised the butt of the shotgun and drew back, preparing to ram it through the window of the car. "No!" Lutz roared, never taking his eyes from the glowing red orbs watching them from the forest. He jammed the clutch in, praying to anyone who might be listening that the car did not stall. He shifted into first, gave the engine some gas, and the car began slowly moving. This entire time he continued staring at the red eyes hovering 20 feet above them. They looked back unwaveringly, glittering with a malevolent intelligence. As the cruiser rolled past, the eyes followed their progress, but did not advance. Lutz fixed his gaze on the rearview mirror, waiting for some ravenous beast to come charging behind them. But there was nothing. The darkness of the night took over, and the eyes receded into the trees. Intent now on putting as much distance between himself and the McGuire farm as possible, Lutz laid one heavy boot on the gas. Only after 10 miles, when he could see the lights of Harry Gibson's fuel station, did he ease his boot off the accelerator and relax the hunched position of his shoulders. 10 minutes later they pulled up to the darkened windows of the sheriff's station. Lutz killed the engine of the cruiser and the 3 men sat in silence. After a long moment, Henry Clarkson opened his mouth. What was that thing he began, but Lutz put up one hand and stopped him. Lutz shook his head, opened the door of the cruiser with a loud creak, and stepped outside. Every muscle in his body was accusing him of gross misconduct, and Lutz knew he would feel the punishment the next day. He unlocked the door to the sheriff's office and went in. The comfortable surroundings of the dingy sheriff's station almost brought him to tears. Weakly buzzing security fluorescents cast a dim, yellowish glow on the familiar disarray of desks and chairs. Without bothering to turn on the main lights, he crossed the bullpen to the corner office at the back of the station and went inside his office. On the bookcase against the far wall was a narrow wooden box, which Lutz now opened for the first time in 10 years. Nestled against dark silk was the bottle of Lagavulin 16, given to him by retiring Sheriff Bradley on his last day in office. There will come a day when you need it. Lutz motioned to Clarkson and Billy, who had followed him into the station and now stood silently behind him, framing the door to his office. Clarkson had fetched 3 glasses from the small kitchen, and he set them down carefully on the stained wood of Lutz's desk. Andrew Lutz sat heavily in his black office chair. He twisted the cap off the bottle of scotch and poured 3 fingers into each glass. The amber liquid glinted dully in the dim light. The powerful, peaty smell of the alcohol bit into his nose as he raised his glass and the 2 men in front of him raised theirs. "Drink up," he advised. In the one smooth motion all 3 of them drained their glasses. The scotch blazed a fiery trail to his stomach. To burn the nightmares away. He reached to refill his glass. The end. Acknowledgements. Creative credit for this idea must be shared with my father Mark, who greatly enjoyed scaring the shit out of his children during long trips on dark country roads. Thank you for keep watching our video till the end.